In my thesis, I've outlined the effects that fossil fuel consumption has had on our economy. Why, from a micro and macro perspective, it is imperative that we shift our energy supply away from fossil fuels. In particular, why, from a behavioral economic standpoint, this will be difficult to achieve, and how, if we apply the macroeconomic principles of monetary theory, we may be able to divert the worst effects of global climate change. E.A. Wrigley, a historical economist, considered fossil fuels and private property institutions to be the two foundational pillars of capitalism. And to an extent, he has been right. The steam engine and the Industrial Revolution fueled the economic expansion of capitalism and helped to create the economic prosperity which we see today. Wrigley made two assumptions about mineral-based energies. He assumed that they were infinite in supply and that they had net positive impacts on society. The first assumption is blatantly false. Fossil fuels are finite in supply and non-renewable. If we look at the second assumption and the projected effects of global climate change, we can easily falsify the second claim as well. One projection estimated that GDP will fall by 20% by the end of the century due to global climate change. Now, greenhouse gases are one of the primary causes of global climate change, and, for example, in the US, fossil fuels are responsible for 76% of greenhouse gases emitted. On a global scale, fossil fuels are responsible for 80% of energy production. Point being, when talking about global climate change, we are inherently talking about energy consumption. The Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Climate Agreement has urged nations to stop relying on fossil fuels as their primary source of energy. They have set goals of limiting global average temperatures to a 2 degrees Celsius increase. These efforts have been vastly unsuccessful. Now, if we do not manage to keep global temperatures from rising, we can expect to see severe global consequences ranging from losses in GDP greater than the Great Depression, shortages of water and food, leaving many in the world starving and thirsty, and masses of refugees displaced by global climate change with no place to seek refuge. Capitalism has an addiction to fossil fuels, and this addiction is having and will continue to have negative effects on the world. To draw a salient example of the future, let's analyze the coronavirus pandemic. Much like an addiction, viruses can have insidious effects on the body, and in the case of a global pandemic, insidious effects on the world. The coronavirus pandemic has made fear prevalent in the minds of consumers, and as such, consumers have rushed to hoard resources which they know will become more scarce. Take for the example toilet paper. People have been rushing to the stores buying out TP as if their lives depended on it. Similarly, in a world where essential resources like land and water become more and more scarce, we can expect to see similar effects with much more dire consequences. In part, we hoard these resources because we are biologically predisposed to do so. For example, a squirrel stores nuts for the winter because she knows they will become more scarce in the future. In the same way, humans will hoard what they know to be valuable. And in the future, where water and land will be more precious than gold, you can bet that people will be hoarding these resources as well. Adam Smith's invisible hand doctrine assumed the pursuit of one's self-interest will result in the promotion of the interests of all. This may be true in a world with plentiful resources, but what about in a world where essential resources are scarce? I'll tell you what happens. The tragedy of the commons occurs, where people take more resources for themselves because it is in their best self-interest to do so, but in doing so, deplete the finite amount of resources, eventually resulting in the ruin of the society as a whole. Furthermore, when humans are faced with scarcity, they begin to act recklessly. For example, people who are impoverished tend to be more susceptible to taking high-risk loans because they are worried about getting by today more so than they are about thriving in the future. In the same way, society has been consuming energy today with no consideration for tomorrow. Similarly, people have also become accustomed to the status quo. This is known as the status quo bias. For example, people used to consider AC to be a luxury in cars. Now it's standard. And if someone was trying to sell you a car without AC in it, you'd probably laugh in their face, and you certainly wouldn't buy their car. The same is true for our energy consumption. We have been accustomed to how much energy we use, and we will not react well to a future where we do not have the same amount of energy. And as it stands, the amount of energy we use is not sustainable. So, what's the solution? Transitioning our primary source of energy away from fossil fuels to something more sustainable will be imperative if we wish to continue feeling effects of economic prosperity. I'd like to argue one of the most viable energy sources in the short term is nuclear power. I'm not talking about uranium reactors, which have problems ranging from nuclear meltdowns to expensive and rare earth metals being their fuel source. One technology that could be implemented in the next 5 years is thorium reactors, which have been proven in the 1960s to be viable alternatives to uranium reactors with a number of benefits. Thorium reactors don't run in the same risk of nuclear meltdowns. They also use a much more abundant resource in the form of thorium as their fuel source, and they have radioactive waste with a fraction of the half-life. Furthermore, it is possible that in the next 15 years, nuclear fusion reactors could create an almost unlimited supply of energy for the world. In theory, fusion reactors have no chance of melting down an abundant fuel source in the form of hydrogen and radioactive waste with an extremely short half-life. Now, along with this, the creation of a robust battery system that can replace the use of combustion engines for transportation will be crucial as well. The glass salt battery is the best solution available. These batteries can hold a charge 3 to 4 times greater than lithium-ion batteries, with materials which are cheaper and easier to acquire, and the ability to charge within minutes rather than hours. Unfortunately, a battery is only as good for the environment as the energy sources being charged by, which today is still 80% fossil fuels. And, as it stands, nuclear energy has a very negative stigma against it. For one, although nuclear energy is already one of the safest forms of energy production, it continues to have a bad reputation because of its association with disasters such as Chernobyl and Fukushima, which elicit fear in people due to the salience and wildly imaginable circumstances which they occur in. Furthermore, nuclear waste will be dangerous for millennia to come and has been dealt with negligibly at best by the U.S., which has no official long-term plan for nuclear waste. Another huge reason nuclear has a bad rap is because of the potential of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. This is why it is imperative that thorium reactors and fusion reactors be marketed to the public for all of their benefits, which include lowered risk of meltdowns, much less nuclear waste production, and a lack of ability to proliferate weapons of mass destruction because they do not create plutonium, the key ingredient in nuclear weaponry. And by doing all of this, hopefully reducing this stigma associated with nuclear power, we will be able to move on with a much more efficient energy source. However, the final issue with nuclear is its cost. But in this next section, I would like to argue why this is potentially not as big of an issue as we think it is by applying the principles of modern monetary theory. So, first off, to understand modern monetary theory, we must first understand the function of fiat currencies. Fiat currencies are created by sovereign governments and create demand through the implementation of taxes on its citizens. Furthermore, unlike the gold standard, which backs its money based on the price of gold, fiat currency is backed by faith. The faith that citizens' money will pay the debts of those private citizens. And by that nature, fiat currencies are endogenous, meaning that they do not require the acquisition of limited resources to create more money. Rather, modern monetary theory assumes that real capital is what constrains economic growth. Real capital being factors such as factories, human capital, and natural resources. Modern monetary theory measures output of a country as being y equals c plus I plus g plus nx, where y is GDP, c is consumption, I is investment, g is government expenditures and tax revenues, and nx is net exports. Furthermore, modern monetary theory states that the savings of the business sector is determined by government expenditures and taxes, as well as net exports and foreign investment. Hence, when the government runs a surplus where T is greater than G, then the business sector will be losing financial assets. Inversely, when the government runs a deficit, G greater than T, then the business sector will be accumulating financial assets, all else equal. The equation goes as follows. S minus I equals G minus T plus CAB, where S is savings, I is investment, G is government expenditures, T is government tax revenues, and CAB is current account balances, which is net exports and net foreign investment. So, from the perspective of MMT in a world with global climate change, we can expect to see a number of negative effects. For one, we can expect to see consumption fall. One study suggests per capita income will likely decrease by 23% by the end of the century due to global climate change. This loss in per capita income will shift the marginal propensity to consume downward due to a loss of consumer confidence. This, in turn, will increase the marginal propensity to save, which will lead to a fall in aggregate demand, leading to decreased economic growth. Another reason why consumption will drop is that the cost of autonomous consumption will rise significantly. As water, food, and land become more scarce, their prices will rise in turn, thus increasing the cost of autonomous consumption. For example, one study suggests that 600 million people will be displaced by coastal flooding by 2100, thus meaning increased demand in land. Investment will likely be hard as well, as people become more pessimistic about future profits in a world with a declining economy. Similarly, net exports will be hit hard. The inevitable scarcity of essential resources such as food and water will halt trade due to hoarding effects of these resources. But there is a potential shift that these effects can go through government intervention. According to MMT, governments should either run deficits or surpluses based on the goals of governments. For this reason, the government sector will likely have the most potential to reduce the effects of global climate change. In particular, if governments can make their goals to reduce the effects of global climate change by increasing taxes on greenhouse gas emissions to account for environmental externalities, while simultaneously increasing investment in nuclear power subsidies, shifting the power supply of the world to something more sustainable for our future, we do have the potential to combat the effects of global climate change. Thank you.